Brett Favre, the most famous thing to come out of Mississippi since, well, incest. Brett Favre's worth something like $100 million, or so we're told, and he wears his right-wing credentials like a badge of dishonor. This is a man who owes his entire career and his wealth to the black men around him, though he's never been one for gratitude, but these days he's dodging reporters the same way he dodged defensive linemen in the NFL. Not very well. I guess that's because there's no black men to protect him on this one. But he doesn't need them. The system ignores criminality based on skin color, and Favre has the complexion for the protection. We'll get to his scamming welfare money to build a volleyball stadium for his daughter in a minute, but you won't be surprised to learn that this isn't the first time that Favre the fraud has been involved in receiving government money under fraudulent circumstances. In 2017 and 2018, Brett Favre got money from Mississippi's Community Education Center, which had money from federal welfare grants. The alleged reason for giving Favre money was because he was supposed to be doing some speaking appearances and such. Of course, he never did any of them, but he kept the money. There were at least 6 indictments that came out of that one, but Brett Favre wasn't one of them. The man who investigated the issue, the auditor, he claimed that there was no evidence that Favre knew that the money he had gotten came from a federal program earmarked for welfare purposes, and the state would allow him to pay back the money in installments. This for a man who's supposed to be worth $100 million, Mississippi's favored son. And the auditor's saying, well, we didn't find any evidence that he knew where the funds were coming from, as if somehow that's supposed to make a difference. If Brett Favre was Deion Sanders, he would have been indicted. And if he said that he didn't know the source of the money, they would have laughed at that and said it doesn't matter. You took the money. You didn't fulfill the contract. That's fraud. That's embezzlement. And you're indicted. Brett DiBiase, who was a pro wrestler, got caught up in that 2017 embezzlement scam. He received money from the same fraudulent state welfare director, and just like Brett Favre, DiBiase was supposed to give talks to teach classes about drug use. He never even showed up to teach those classes. Instead, DiBiase went to a luxury drug rehab center in Malibu. But just like Brett Favre, he kept the money. Now, in DiBiase's case, he was treated a little bit differently. He did get charged, and the feds had been asking a few questions about DiBiase's $1.5 million home, as if they were going to seize it or something. But DiBiase, like Favre, is genetically immune from the law, so in the end, all he had to do was pay a $48,000 fine. Just like Brett Favre, just go ahead and pay us some money and we'll say all's well. There's an old saying that rich people don't go to jail, they go to court. No, black people go to jail. People with genetic immunity from law merely go to court. Now, this all is what Brett Favre was involved in before this latest scandal with his daughter's volleyball stadium. If Brett Favre had been black, there would be congressional hearings, there would be Treasury Department and FBI agents crawling all over that state, there would be talk about withholding federal funds from those schools, the universities, audits and investigations would be flying left, right, and center. But that last incident barely made even a ripple. I guess people felt that he hadn't run off with enough money, so now more recently it's been revealed that the conservative icon and right-wing hero Brett Favre has been caught with his hand in the exact same cookie jar again. Same scam, same source, same year. Only this time we found out there was a lot more money that he had run off with. In July 2017, Favre the fraud met with Mississippi officials about giving him money for his volleyball stadium. That was a vanity project for his daughter, who was going to attend the University of Southern Mississippi to play volleyball there. Favre wanted money from the Mississippi Department of Human Services. Now, this was at the same time that Favre was getting money for those school talks that he never gave. But as I said before, the good old boys in Mississippi who were supposed to be investigating this claimed that Favre didn't know where the money for the talks that he never gave came from, so he was unaware he was doing anything wrong, right? He had no idea that he was doing anything wrong or where the money came from, right? Well, as it turns out, in August 2017, Brett Favre sent a now infamous text message to Nancy New, who was one of the heads of the nonprofit organization Mississippi Community Education Center, which the state of Mississippi government loves to float all that money to. Now, in this text message, Favre asked her, if you were to pay me, is there any way the media can find out where it came from and how much? Now, this is gangster secret envelope full of cash stuff here that Brett Favre is doing. His concern was that the media wouldn't find out. Not that the state authorities wouldn't find out because they're as corrupt as he is. Favre's major concern was that if this came to light, this would put a blemish on his phony baloney, fraudulent, all-American guy image, which was nothing more than an invention of the white media. And you'll notice his words. He wrote, "If you pay me." He didn't say whatever fund or trust that he wanted the money put into. He said me personally. He wanted the money, but he didn't want anyone to know that he was getting it. And if he's talking to Nancy New, that means he knew exactly where the money was coming from. Anyway, 2 months later, Nancy New misappropriates $5 million to go to Favre's vanity project. The money was embezzled from federal funds, and the TANF funds couldn't be used for brick-and-mortar construction, so instead, the Mississippi miscreants invented a phony story to get around the federal restrictions. They said that the facility was a wellness center, and they claimed that the facility would be used to help needy families. Of course, the facility was never and hasn't been used for needy families at all. And that is far from the only incident of Mississippi state money malfeasance that Brett the Fraud Favre has been involved in. Favre also was involved with a medical startup. No, not Elizabeth Holmes, though given Favre's low IQ, I would have thought that too. Favre was involved with a company called Pravacus in 2014, and he's really tight with Pravacus's founder, Jacob Van Landingham. Now, Van Landingham was trying to figure out how to get his hands on some quick cash. So Favre recommended that Van Landingham reach out to Governor Phil Bryant, who's a good buddy of Brett Favre's, and see if the governor would be able to help pony up some cash for this company. And did Brett Favre think that this might be illegal? Well, as Brett Favre himself put it, "Don't know if legal or not, but we need to cut him in." Cut him in? That's a weird way to talk about somebody if you're not expecting to give them some cash, right? And did anything come of all this behind-the-scenes good old boy cronyism? Well, Governor Bryant made sure that Pravacus was connected to investors and helped them to deal with federal regulators. And for this, Governor Bryant was offered stock in Pravacus to be given to him after he left office. Now, former Governor Bryant claims that he never accepted the stock offer. By the way, this is how bribes are carried out in the U.S. This is why you have clowns like Negro Jim Clyburn and his daughter who lick the boots of white corporations, and then afterwards, these illiterate morons who can't even spell job get offered high-paying corporate positions, which usually only amount to them having a job on paper, but they get paid six figures annually anyway. This is how corporations pay back government officials for all the favors they give them. After these guys leave office, the corporations give these politicians what amounts to a de facto corporate pension. But at any rate, Favre wanted to do everything that he could for Pravacus because he was involved with the company, so he called his pal Nancy New and asked her to give some state money to Pravacus. Brett Favre would host a meeting at his home. In attendance was Nancy New, also John Davis, the corrupt director of Mississippi's Department of Human Services, which all this money was coming through, and Jacob Van Landingham. Directly after that meeting, Van Landingham offered Nancy New 50,000 shares in the company. Just goes to show how stupid Brett and his pals are. Now, Nancy New, recognizing that this couldn't be seen as anything other than a naked bribe, refused. Van Landingham texted Favre about this, and Brett Favre's reply was, "Hell, we giving her something." To which Van Landingham replied, "I'll slip it to her." Van Landingham later told Favre that he gave Nancy New the 50,000 shares and made sure that it was the good shares that won't cost her or have a tax requirement. Brett Favre's response to giving a government official a bribe? Now that's awesome! But because Brett Favre is a recipient of racial privilege, he doesn't know how to actually work or pay bills. He just screws the system and depends on other people to pay his bills for him or let him off the hook for the bills. So when Favre found out that he was on the hook for $1.1 million in debt related to the building of his phony volleyball stadium, well, he knew exactly what to do about that. He texted John Davis, the corrupt director of Mississippi's Department of Human Services, and said, "Hey, brother, Deanna," talking about Brett Favre's wife, "and I still owe $1.1 million on volleyball. Any chance you and Nancy can help with that? They don't need it at the moment." Favre went on to add, "You and Nancy stuck your neck out for me with Jake and Pravacus, and I know that's going to turn out very good, I believe." This is how casual Favre the fraud is about the money that he was getting. He knew what was going on, he knew where the money was coming from, and he knew these corrupt racist degenerates would cover for him, which they have. But here he is receiving all this embezzled money under fraudulent pretenses, being completely and thoroughly misappropriated. Of course the guy knew about it. So he's calling up all of these Mississippi government officials, got him on speed dial, now we know what he was doing during the off-season in the NFL, and telling them pay his bills for him. By now, all this fraud was becoming so obvious that people outside of the circle of embezzlers were starting to notice. John Davis, the corrupt director of Mississippi's Department of Human Services, suddenly decided that he wanted to retire early in a surprise announcement. But as it turned out, he was actually told to quit by Governor Bryant after a human services employee came forward with a tip about suspected fraud. Now, John Davis and Nancy New wound up getting themselves arrested in early February 2020 by the new auditor, and Brett Favre's medical company Prevacus was named in the indictments. Now, the interesting thing about that is a few days earlier, Brett Favre had been bragging to the Associated Press that he had raised all this money for that volleyball center, mostly through donations. He wasn't calling it a wellness center. Quote, "We wanted to do something for a high school in Southern Miss. It's hard to get people to donate for volleyball, but we'll be opening an $8 million facility that will be as good as any in the country at Southern Mississippi." So while he was wheeling, dealing, and stealing behind the scenes and handing out bribes like Al Capone, he gets in front of the white media and claims that the money was all grassroots. This was the result of donations. These are the lengths that Brett Favre and his racist pals in Mississippi state government went to just to build a vanity project stadium for the welfare king's little girl. And you wonder why Mississippi is the poorest state in America? By the way, a Republican-run state. The poorest states in the country are all red states, and their plum-dumb residents still haven't figured out why. The state of Mississippi received $135 million in federal aid in 2018. Only 5% of it went to cash assistance for poor families. On the other hand, Mississippi Community Education Center, who was floating all this money to Brett Favre and others, they received $44 million. And we can see where all that money went. This is who Brett Favre, Mississippi's favored son, is. This is who and what he is. Just like the rest of the dominant society, this is racial privilege. This isn't just the face of welfare fraud. This is the face of racial privilege in America. This is what it looks like. This is how it manifests itself. So what kind of price is Brett Favre going to pay? Well, apparently his little podcast or radio show, what they said is that they're going to suspend it for a couple of days. Suspend it, not suspend him, but we're going to be suspending operations for a couple of days. Yeah, don't want any callers calling and say, Brett Favre, you're going to pay that money back. Brett Favre should be made to pay the highest price possible for this. He's a criminal. His NFL title should be stripped. The NFL should be distancing itself from him and doing everything they can to ditch this guy. He should be removed from the NFL Hall of Fame. He should be removed from all NFL films, any mention of the guy. This is a scumbag who took money from the poorest of the poor. He got caught conspiring with state officials to keep it hidden from the media. He's sitting here just joyfully talking about giving out bribes to state officials. And by the way, when he asked that question about, is there any way the media could find out about this, where the money's coming from or where it's going, that's called knowledge of guilt. He knew he was doing something potentially illegal and he was trying to take steps to keep it hidden. So he knew what he was doing was wrong. And even so, just like 2 years ago, rinse and repeat, no charges for him. There certainly won't be any charges at the state level, but just like DiBiase, there won't be any at the federal level either, unless, of course, you can get that idiot Merrick Garland to wake up from his coma. Brett Favre's not black, so apparently this doesn't rise to any level of real severity or need for attention. But Brett Favre's story is typical. Why is it that we only see white people, white athletes who are able to get the government to give them money for buildings and complexes built and black people can't entirely? It's not because they put in the work. It's not because they had better ideas. And it's not because they filled out the paperwork correctly. That's usually the lie du jour that we always hear. Black people don't have the right paperwork, or they don't have the right qualifications, or they just weren't ready. No. This is what the real reason is, and what it's always been, what it always is. Because as we've seen with the Jackson water crisis, when it comes to black people, they deliberately and often illegally withhold it from us. See reparations. And of course, the white right-wing media, they're trying to pretend as if none of this is happening. They don't want to talk about this at all. Oh, they were all hot and bothered to talk about the NFL during the protests because they thought they could make hay out of it. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about NFL legend, NFL hero, Mississippi's favored son, Brett Favre. All of a sudden, let's talk about something else. As an example, the Federalist, they gave away the game on Brett Favre. The only use they have for him is as a right-wing operative whose job is to agitate and inflame the most backward, most violent, least intelligent segment of the society. He's a tool. He's not trying to unite people, as the Federalist Society put it themselves. He's fighting the culture war. So the right-wing nuts that he dog whistles to, they understand full well that when he says he wants politics out of sports, that means stop black athletes from exercising their free speech. Brett Favre has endorsed GOP candidates for years, not just Donald Trump, but also others. And that's fine because that's not controversial. The reason it's not controversial is it's not a black person who's doing it. By the way, you're probably wondering what this Federalist website has had to say about Favre, the fraud, since they posted this asinine article. Well, they haven't had anything to say about him. Certainly not this year. Yep, he was the poster boy for conservative values. That is, until his conservative values got exposed for all the world to see. Stealing, lying, lining your pockets with public money while claiming everybody else needs to stop depending on the government. That is conservatism. A putrid ball of hypocrisy wrapped up in a pack of lies. In Mississippi, the GOP-controlled legislature has used their position to withhold funds from majority black cities, including their own state's capital, and to hand money to white enclaves and certain interested white parties, individuals, and companies. For the lame brains who keep telling us that we should switch to the GOP, this is what you want us to switch to? Because it looks like the same old racism as the DNC to me. But of course, this goes without saying. The white right wears their racism as a badge of honor. They poke fun at their own well-known bigotry while laughing as they pretend to deny it. The poorest states in the U.S. are Republican states. The states that are the most dependent on federal funds are Republican states, particularly the states of the old Confederacy and the white supremacists in the Northwest. But these white supremacists can only get away with it because they're allowed to. The Democrats could have easily dealt with them a long time ago. They didn't need to wait, but they do nothing until these things become so huge and egregious that they at least have to acknowledge that it happened. Part of it is because the Democrats are practicing the same kind of fraud and malfeasance in their own states. They're neck deep in it too. But another part of the Democrats' refusal to do anything about it is because this is how white power works. And both parties are instrumental in it because both parties benefit from it. One hand washes the other. One hand protects the other. Democrats have no problem with Republicans raping state economies so long as the racial status quo is maintained, and that means the black economic position cannot change. Anti-black racism is a bipartisan issue. But as far as welfare in the U.S. goes, this is just another reminder of who the biggest welfare cheats and scammers have always been. Who's really screwing the system? The people who the government and the media don't talk about. This is why the Republicans spend so much time trying to make black people the face of welfare, when the opposite is true. And now you see why Democrats let them do it. For them, it's not about the money. The same reason all those white men who ran the global economy into the ditch in 2008 never went to prison. This is about keeping up appearances. When too many white men with money are getting bad press, well, you got to find one rich black man to crucify as a distraction. And once this blows over, Favre's name won't be brought up regularly in the white media as to make it synonymous with welfare fraud or fraud of any sort. It will be allowed to fall down the memory hole. Brett Favre ought to be indicted. He's committed a raft of crimes, from embezzlement to bribery to conspiracy, but this country understands that it needs its icons, especially the white ones. Why, he's the quintessential good old boy all-American. And all-American means white, so that being the case, well, we can't allow his image to be tarnished because it tarnishes the group that he's with. Black people who are famous are supposed to be put in prison or otherwise disgraced for the smallest incident, the smallest accusation. Part of white supremacy is that it doesn't happen to those who are the right color. These white supremacists are constantly projecting. The biggest recipients of welfare and government money, the people who are always screwing the system, are trying to demonize the people who, by their own accounting, don't get anything from the government. Black people are completely and thoroughly denied government funds. You see that in Mississippi right now with the Jackson water crisis. And yet they say, well, black people shouldn't be depending on the government. Guilty dogs bark the loudest. Well, we're going to be shouting down the white media propaganda, and we're not going to be allowing people to forget about this. We're going to do our part to make sure that nobody ever forgets that Brett Favre is the MVP of Mississippi welfare fraud. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Don Mullen, Mark Singleton, Chloe, Bomber777, and Afro Elite. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.